Hi everyone, my name is Matt Jarbo. Welcome to Podio Commentary. This is the episode about The Thing, one of my all-time favorite movies. It's got everything. It's got horror, it's got science fiction, it's got body horror, it's got cute dogs, and it's got Kurt Russell with an amazing beard. This series normally is read off of a teleprompter, just to be honest with you guys, but I wanted to try something a little bit different. I wanted to do something a little bit more conversational in order to keep you guys in the conversation with me as we go through the history of this movie. Because if you're like me, you love movies. If you're like me, you want to know about the making of them, the history, what's involved, and all the stuff in between. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please subscribe, hit the bell, and hit the notification so you know when a new episode drops. So let's dive into John Carpenter's magnificent film. This movie opened back in 1982, and I'm not gonna lie, it released to theaters at probably not the best time. I actually think that a quote from Back to the Future, which came out 3 years later, best summarizes this movie. And this is when Marty McFly says, "Guess you guys aren't ready for that yet, but your kids are gonna love it." And that, of course, is everything surrounding the legacy of The Thing. But let's talk about this low-budget creature feature, because The Thing, when it came out, was trashed by critics upon its release. I mean, some were literally calling it trash. Others called it unwatchable. One idiot, I don't know who it was, but this is what I read, called it instant junk. Yeah, okay, your opinion's instant junk, sir. But anyway, you have a magazine called Cinema Fantastique that called it the most hated film of all time. Let's be real. The Thing did not do well. But John Carpenter did ultimately get the last laugh because, hey, half a generation later, this film is regarded as one of the best horror movies of all time and frequently makes several critics and fans' top films list. But why didn't the movie do well in the summer of 1982 when it was released? What was it about The Thing that didn't connect with critics or audiences for that fact? Some have argued that it was John Carpenter's more nihilistic tone during a recession that lasted between the start of 1980 and the beginning of 1983, much of which was actually caused by the Iranian Revolution, which led to the 1979 energy crisis. People wanted an escape. And in the year of Spielberg's E.T., maybe that's what they were looking for. However, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner also came out in theaters on the exact same day and suffered a very similar fate to The Thing, only to become an iconic science fiction film heavily regarded years later. Ironic, isn't it? But look, this isn't a story about the top films from 1982. This is a tale of how a low-budget horror movie got made and captivated fans old and new nearly 4 decades later. This is the story of The Thing. Now, the story begins ultimately back in the 1970s when Universal Pictures was approached about filming an adaptation of John W. Campbell's novella Who Goes There?, which is a science fiction story about an Antarctic research camp that battles a shape-shifting alien. The story was first published all the way back in 1938 and went on to be called one of the finest science fiction stories ever written by the science fiction writers of America. Now, Who Goes There was originally adapted back in 1951 under the name The Thing from Another World. That movie was actually a success during its first year, grossing nearly $2 million in America and Canada, and it actually went on to become the highest grossing science fiction movie that year, even beating out the classic The Day the Earth Stood Still. It only made sense that producers David Foster and Lawrence Terman would want to tackle that property again. The only downside is that they didn't have the rights to make it. Yeah, so they're going to go make this movie, and they want to go make this movie that they don't have the rights to. So they had to go and seek those out. Well, it turns out that 2 screenwriters, Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins, actually held the rights to Who Goes There. And when approached about making this new movie, they went, we're good. Yeah, they passed. I mean, it makes sense, kind of for the time, but still, however, undeterred, David Foster and Lawrence Terman went to Universal and actually got them to put up the money to buy the rights for the book from the 2 screenwriters. Then a producer by the name of Wilbur Stark approached 3 Wall Street guys who happened to have the remake rights to 23 of RKO Pictures movies, including The Thing from Another World, but they didn't know what to do with them, so this guy comes in and he picks up the rights to these movies. This is when Universal sees an opening and they actually bought the rights to The Thing from Another World from Stark, who ultimately went on to get an executive producer credit on all advertisements. Like, we're talking posters, commercials, studio press material, everything. But like I said, critics really hated this movie at first. I mean, even Roger Ebert called it a great barf bag movie. So maybe Wilbur Stark didn't really feel like he won out on anything at the time. Sadly, though, he died in 1995, so he never really got to see his acquisition ever be truly appreciated, which is sad. It's actually really sad because this movie has gone on to do so well, and at the time he probably hated it. It's just one of those things that kind of happens in Hollywood. It sucks, it's tragic, but it's true. Now listen, John Carpenter was the first person to be approached for this remake, but because he was mainly like an independent filmmaker, Universal didn't want to go that way. In fact, they went and they chose Texas Chainsaw Massacre's Tobe Hooper, largely in part because they already had this guy under contract, right? So why go and outsource a director when you've got a very popular horror writer-director right here who was already under contract? I mean, that did make the most amount of sense, but Hooper's pitch was not something that the producers were actually happy with. His approach was something more slapstick, from what I read, which doesn't make any sense looking at the context of the story, and I understand why they wanted to move to different writers and different pitches. I mean, at one point, they even actually reached out to John Landis, and they were looking at bringing in John Landis, which would have been really fascinating. I think taking his aesthetic from, let's say, an American Werewolf in London and putting it into The Thing would have been very fascinating. But ultimately, I'm very happy with the way things turned out. I'm not complaining at all. So, with no directors attached and nothing really coming to fruition, the studio actually put the project on hold for a while. And that is until Ridley Scott's Alien blew up in theaters back in 1979, and it completely revitalized the project. At this point, John Carpenter was approached once again, and he became loosely attached because of the success of Halloween and The Fog. Now, here's the funny thing. Carpenter was actually really hesitant about this project at first. He really enjoyed The Thing from Another World, so much so that it actually was cameoed in Halloween, but he thought that it would be difficult to surpass, and it was actually here that his friend and co-producer Scott Cohen recommended that he just go and read the original novella for inspiration. Carpenter found the book to be really interesting, especially the creepiness of the shape-shifting alien and the questions that it raised. He figured that the story was as timely for him as the original was when it came out. And I wonder if that has anything to do with the ongoing Cold War at the time. You know, part of the idea when they get to the Antarctic research base and why they have all those guns had a lot to do with the Cold War and potentially a Russian invasion on a continent that really has no indigenous people and nothing of actual value outside of research potential, right? I get that. So I'm wondering if that was playing into the time. I couldn't find anything on it, but that's just my take. But when it came to the script, the film had actually gone through several writers before landing on Carpenter's desk, and he didn't want to write the movie himself. He had recently finished Escape from New York, and then he failed to finish The Philadelphia Experiment because he couldn't really nail that third act, and he just wanted somebody else to handle it, which I totally understand and I totally get. But eventually, Bill Lancaster was brought on board to the project. He had talked to the producers about tackling the film all the way back in 1977, but he was under the impression that they just wanted to remake The Thing from Another World. However, now that the film was an adaptation of Who Goes There, Lawrence was able to pitch an idea that was closer to the novella, and it didn't hurt that John Carpenter was also a big fan of Lancaster's writings on The Bad News Bears, which is also a great film. You should see it. Initially, though, Lancaster had a couple issues when it came to adapting the novella. The book didn't feature much action, and it had far too many characters, 37 to be exact. That's a lot of characters. That's a lot of time spent with these people in this environment. It's just too much for a movie. Lancaster actually dropped this down to 12 to make it easier for the audience to understand. And it just saves you on time. Unless there's a big scene where they're just eliminating everybody inside of this base, they're just getting slaughtered by the thing left and right. A creepy horror, a creature feature, something that's going to be building on tension. This makes the best sense, and it was the right move. Now, when it came to the character of MacReady, Lancaster changed him up too. In the original novella, MacReady was a meteorologist who was the clear protagonist. Lancaster changed him to be more of a loner who likes chess and is just in this for the money. The reason was to create an ensemble piece where one person would emerge as the hero and not immediately start the film that way. But it's Kurt Russell. You already knew he was going to be the hero, but I understand what Lancaster was going for. MacReady is just kind of one of the guys, and by the end, he is the protagonist. Now, from here, Lancaster did seem to hit the ground running. He cranked out 30 to 40 pages, but this is when he hit a wall with the film's second act. It did take him a few months to finish the script, and once it was done, he and Carpenter spent a weekend in Northern California refining it. And this is really what they spent a lot of time on. It was really the ending of the movie, because the ending of the film was altered from Who Goes There. Originally, the book ends with the humans obviously being victorious, but they are concerned that a flock of birds headed towards the mainland could be infected with the thing. Carpenter, he wanted something different. He wanted the film to end with the humans defeating the thing, but choosing to slowly freeze to death in order to make sure that humanity is saved from infection. Carpenter believed that this was the ultimate heroic act. Lawrence did write this ending, but he added in a Twilight Zone ambiguous twist that showed the moment of trust and mistrust, fear and relief. And that ending is pretty iconic in my opinion, but we will talk about that more here in a second. And when it came to the casting, all right, Kurt Russell was not always involved in the movie. He was involved in the production, but he wasn't cast as MacReady yet. Even though he had worked with John Carpenter twice before, there's the obvious Escape from New York, which we all know and we love, but the first time they worked together was actually a made-for-TV movie called Elvis. It was a biopic about Elvis with Kurt Russell playing Elvis, which he did reprise the role down the road for 3,000 Miles to Graceland. And kind of a weird thing if you think about it, but they did this movie together, and so they had a good working relationship, and that's actually one of the big reasons. But Carpenter did want to keep his options open before bringing Kurt Russell on, and they did look at some other big names like Jeff Bridges, Nick Nolte, and Christopher Walken. At one point, they even actually reached out to Sam Shepard because he had expressed interest, but ultimately never pursued the role. I can't imagine any of those other guys, with the exception of Jeff Bridges, as being MacReady. I think Kurt Russell nails it. Christopher Walken would have been like super intense, like Matthew McConaughey in True Detective season 1 kind of intense, which would be a very interesting aesthetic overall. But I think at the end of the day, we're good with what we got. But here's the reason why Kurt Russell was chosen, and this is true. He chose Kurt Russell because he knew that Kurt Russell was reliable and he wouldn't complain about the difficult working conditions, because they're shooting this thing in Alaska and they're shooting it in British Columbia. They're going to be outside in the cold for a number of weeks. So he didn't want anyone who's going to be constantly whining, and he knew Kurt Russell was a pro. So there you go. Here's a fun little side fact. It actually took Kurt Russell a whole year to grow the MacReady beard. And look, as a guy who has a beard who could never grow like that, it's a glorious beard. It's a magnificent beard. All hail the MacReady beard. But when it came to the character of MacReady himself, John Carpenter and Kurt Russell, they really wanted to dive into the backstory, and they came up with this idea that he's actually an ex-Vietnam vet who was involved in some kind of tragedy, and as a result, he suffers from PTSD, alcoholism, and severe insomnia. This backstory didn't make it into the film, but it is one of the reasons why MacReady overall wasn't bothered by grotesque violence. He saw some shit. He was in the shit, And I think that would have been very interesting to explore, but I'm also, they didn't have a lot of time, and that is something that does get brought up later on with the edit. So the film itself had a budget of about $15 million, which was the largest budget Carpenter had worked with at the time. Look, he made Halloween for just $375,000 a few years earlier. Now, the two movies are incomparable in regards to settings, but still, he knows how to operate within that independent film budget style. This was actually a huge step up in that department, and I personally think that John Carpenter found it a little bit intimidating. So having someone like Kurt Russell with whom he trusted on board just seemed to make a lot of sense. And that is something that, again, comes through with this movie, and it's one of the reasons why it's been, I believe, as endearing and long-lasting as it has been. Although, by bringing on Kurt Russell, it did have a bit of downside for the budget. Originally, the actors were only going to get paid $50,000 each. But because Kurt Russell had been around for so long and was a well-known actor, his price tag was $400,000. Hey, look, money well spent in my opinion. But when you think about the role of Childs, Keith David always knocked it out of the park, but the role wasn't his initially. Originally, Bernie Casey read for the role. The same with Carl Weathers. Now, that would have been fascinating in my opinion. Isaac Hayes is also someone who Carpenter really looked at because they had worked together on Escape from New York and he could trust him. But at this point in time, it was really Ernie Hudson who was the front runner until they met Keith David. And while this was his first significant film role, all of his years of theater experience really trained him for it. Though he did have to learn how to kind of hold himself back and not show every emotion that the character was feeling. In fact, Richard Masur, who played Clark in the movie, worked with Keith David to really tone down the emotions and to be more screen ready. It was here that the two came to the decision to add more tension to the film by having Clark and Childs not like each other. This was also brought on by the fact that both men were the largest cast members, physically speaking, so to have them kind of be at each other seemed to really build up the tension, and I think that it worked. Now, eventually, the rest of the roles were filled out by casting Wilford Brimley, who, believe it or not, was kind of an unknown at the time. This is before diabetes. So this was early on. And then you had T.K. Carter, David Clennon, Richard Dysart, Charles Hallahan, Peter Maloney, Donald Moffat, Joel Polis, and Thomas G. Waits in supporting roles. There was no female role in this movie. There was no female character outside of Adrienne Barbeau, John Carpenter's wife at the time, who voiced MacReady's chess computer. What was really interesting about that at the time was, I think it was Kurt Russell who said that there was no female for the men to posture to. So there was that dynamic removed, and this was like basically just pure ego and machismo, which I actually really think worked out well for this particular situation. Well, what about the filming of the movie? Okay, well, principal photography began in Juneau, Alaska, August 24th, 1981. Carpenter wanted to make best use of the time, so he actually ordered that there was 2 weeks of rehearsal time before they began filming, which I believe really helped, especially with the whole Richard Masur and Keith David situation. It just allows the actors to get used to one another and to know what's going to be happening, and then to make sure that they can give the best performances and not waste a lot of time on takes and retakes and things like that. But the film was also pretty extensively storyboarded by Mike Plug and Mentor Hubner. Their work was actually so detailed that quite a few of the film's shots pretty much replicate their storyboards completely. It just goes to show you that when they were doing the pre-production on this movie, they really wanted to make the best use of their time and to make sure that what they wanted to do would be the end result. And I love that, because so many movies these days, they just throw it all at the wall and they fix it in post, and then they go back and they fix it again, and it just comes across as kind of corporate. This movie was definitely a labor of love. Now, 12 weeks later, after they got done shooting in Alaska, they moved to the Universal backlot in Los Angeles. This is where things got a little bit funny, because they went from filming in Alaska temperatures, even in August, it still gets chilly, to being over 100 degrees in the Los Angeles area. To fix this for the interior shots, the design team grabbed as many air conditioners as they could, and they mixed them with humidifiers and misters in order to moisturize the air, you know what I mean? To add moisture to it, to make sure it looked like they were actually still in the Antarctic. Producers hated this idea at first because of how costly it would be, so they actually thought about putting the movie into gigantic cold storage lockers and filming inside there, but they didn't because they realized that it's far too claustrophobic, so air conditioner city it was. Quick side note about this particular time in production. It was during these interior scenes where the famous autopsy scene takes place, John Carpenter said in a DVD commentary that Wilford Brimley is like the only actor to not get squeamish from the fact that they used real animal organs in the scene, which is creepy. But what's even crazier was when the dude gets his arms bit off, that was actually a double amputee actor that they just put fake arms on in order to replicate the gore from that scene. I love this movie for like the sickening violence that goes into it. But it was during this time where Carpenter began to look at the rough assembly cut, and he realized that, he didn't like that there were too many shots of actors just standing around and talking. So he rewrote some of the shots that they had already done in order to take further advantage of the exteriors for their next shoot, which was going to be in Stewart, British Columbia. Carpenter wanted to be authentic to the story. Like, he wanted to be as authentic as he could, which is why he wanted to shoot on location rather than just use a studio backlot. The success of both Halloween and The Fog actually gave him the credibility he needed to get these requests granted. And on December 2nd, 1981, over 100 American and Canadian crew members descended upon British Columbia to film for just 3 weeks. But here's where things got kind of nasty for the production team. The sets, they'd already been built in the summer, so they would be covered in snow by the time filming took place in British Columbia. However, it was so cold that some of the cameras actually froze up and broke, and the crew had to leave the working cameras in those conditions in order to keep the lenses from fogging up, which took hours to clear. And what's crazy is one day, while the crew was making their 23-mile trip from a small mining town to the set, they almost slid their bus off of a 500-foot embankment. This would have probably injured, if not killed, a number of people. So let's be very, very, very happy that that didn't happen. But listen, filmmaking is kind of always suffering for your craft, if you think about it. And speaking of suffering for your craft, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up Rob Bottin. Rob was the special effects designer on the film, and a lot of people are under the impression that Stan Winston did everything for this movie. I actually was until I started researching it, but that simply isn't true. Rob was the guy on the production, and at the age of 22 when they were filming, he was 22 years old when he was taking on this role and commanding a team of 40 people to do the visual effects work for this film, which again, this is the stuff that's lived on in infamy for nearly 4 decades. So give it up to Rob. But the problem though, is that he brought it, right? And he brought it so hard that it ultimately caused him to have a bleeding ulcer, and he had to be hospitalized for exhaustion. He spent over a year just living on the Universal lot, sleeping on the sets or in the locker rooms. I mean, this guy made it his entire life, and it just burned him out. Now, in order to kind of take some of the pressure off his team, he did bring in Stan Winston in order to help out. And so when he was off being treated in the hospital, Winston took over, and that is where the whole myth came from. Again, that's just such an amazing thing that this person would dedicate so much of his life to where he got an ulcer and had to go to the hospital because he wanted to make this movie as perfect as he could. He was 22 at the time. That's just wild to me and commendable at the same time. All right, so when they got to the finale of the movie, this is where it gets a little crazy because the crew needed to destroy the Arctic base. We've all seen the movie. It's there. It took the crews over 8 hours to rig this set with explosives. Carpenter used 7 different cameras to capture the blast because you only get one shot at it. But what this required were the camera assistants to literally stand in the base until it was time to shoot, in which case they had to set the record button on the camera and then get the hell out of there. And they had to get to safety. I mean, you're literally asking 7 camera assistants to stand in a building that is going to explode, and then they only have a couple of seconds to get the hell out of there. There's a lot of trust in Carpenter, and trust well earned, I should say. But it worked out really well for everyone because once they destroyed the set, they were actually able to double dip on production and use it as the exterior for the burned up Norwegian base. So that's pretty cool. But one interesting element is the finale of the film. Carpenter ultimately shot 2 different endings. The first one, which is the one we all know and love, is the more bleak and nihilistic take. that producers feared it wouldn't test well, and they were right, to be fair. But the other one actually shows MacReady getting rescued and then testing his blood to show that he's not infected. Carpenter wasn't a fan of this ending because he felt that it was too cheesy. And the ending of the movie was actually a pretty big point of controversy during the post-production phase. They asked Verna Fields, their editor, to rework the ending so it had clarity and resolution. They removed all doubt that Childs had been infected, and that left MacReady all alone. This new ending only tested slightly better with audiences than the original. But before the film could go to print, it was decided last minute to restore the original ambiguous ending and to add a monster scream over the base exploding. This was clearly meant to indicate that the thing had died and leave it less ambiguous for audiences to figure out on their own, because unfortunately, audiences like things wrapped up in a nice, neat little bow. So, one of the cooler factors of this movie has always been the score. Enrico Morricone, he's famous for it, right? I mean, to fans, he's famous for it. To a lot of other people, he's not. But when it comes to the scores of the movies, Carpenter normally does it himself, right? But this time he wanted the thing to kind of have a European musical approach. So he jumped on a flight, flew to Rome, like you do, to speak with Enrico Morricone about composing the score. Morricone agreed and composed 20 minutes that John Carpenter could use in the movie, like wherever he wanted. But Carpenter still went off to go make his own music to add into scenes where it was, in his own description, it was like background noise. That's his justification for it. He had 20 minutes of composed music to use, which he did. But when he couldn't use it, he went off and did his own thing. It's the indie filmmaker in him. You are never, ever, ever going to get rid of that one. But what's really, really, really funny about this whole thing is that when the movie came out, Morricone was actually nominated for a Razzie for the worst soundtrack of the year. The Thing was nominated for the worst sound. Everyone hated this movie when it came out. I don't get it. Again, whatever. However, when he went to go work on The Hateful Eight with Quentin Tarantino, he used part of that score that he had done for The Thing that had been left unused at that point, and he won an Academy Award for it. I mean, there is such a deep level of irony here I can't even wrap my brain around, but that's the industry. So, with the film finished and the ambiguous ending back in place, the film was released on June 25th, 1982 to just 840 screens, and it only pulled in a meager $3.1 million. It opened at number 8 on the top 10, with Poltergeist at number 6, Blade Runner at number 2, and E.T. the Extraterrestrial was number 1 that weekend. But what's really fascinating was Porky's was actually number 12 that weekend, and it had a total box office earnings at that point of over $96 million. Porky's made that kind of cash. I love Porky's, but damn. Anyway, ultimately, The Thing did only go on to earn about $19.5 million in total, and it was the 42nd highest grossing movie in 1982, which apparently isn't a flop, but it's also nowhere near a hit. And even the cast apparently didn't like the movie, as I mentioned before. Some found it to be too violent and gory, and Kurt Russell wasn't even a big fan on how the relationship between the characters was kind of cut short. And, I get that. Actors are building up their craft. Actors are always trying to build up these scenes. And they put a lot of work into these characters, and to have all that stuff kind of cut down, I can get it. However, many of the cast have actually come around to the film since its release. Again, it's been 4 decades. A lot of people who hated the movie originally love it now. It's just kind of how it goes. But one interesting little side note here is how Universal executive Sid Sheinberg tried to quote-unquote help the movie. He's the one who put the tagline on the poster, "The ultimate in alien terror." And he did this in order to capitalize on Ridley Scott's Alien, the movie that ultimately got this film made. I get it, but still, it's like, come on, we all kind of knew what you're trying to do there. And he's the one who edited a completely different cut of the film for network television. The one that removes 12 minutes from the theatrical. It added narration and a different ending where the Thing imitates a dog and escapes the ruined camp, which actually I think that's the first one I saw. I think I saw it on network television first. I remember that ending. So yeah, it's like, it's bad. But Carpenter disowned this version and theorized that Scheinberg had been mad at him for not taking his creative ideas on board for the theatrical cut. Oh, gee, Willikers, a vengeful producer? No. Always with these producers, always thinking they're the ones. Now, if you want to see this television cut of the movie, you can. It's currently available on the 2016 Scream Factory Blu-ray release, which is available on Amazon right now for about $24, down from like $40. But the vastly superior Arrow version of the release is region locked to the UK, and you can import it, but it's like $50, and there's no 4K release of the movie just yet. Now, I believe that we're going to get this in 2022 when it hits the 40th anniversary of the movie. It just seems to make the most amount of sense, and that's my take on it. However, there are a couple things that do continue the story to an extent. We all know about the 2011 movie with the same name that operates as a prequel. I personally haven't seen it because I heard it wasn't good, and I just kind of never got around to checking it out, but I will have to do that now. I did, however, play the 2003 Xbox video game that was more or less a sequel, and I liked it quite a bit, and I am hoping that we get a remastered version of that coming out at some point. Like I said, 40th anniversary, that's coming up next year, Xbox Game Pass, it just seems to make the most amount of sense. Oh, and if you're a comic book reader, there's actually a couple comic books that continue MacReady's story, and they're pretty interesting if you're into that sort of thing. You can find recaps here on YouTube, so you can just look those up if you don't want to go pay for it, but they are available on Amazon and I think eBay and stuff. However, probably the most interesting thing is the alternate version of John W. Campbell's Who Goes There. It's called Frozen Hell. This version was recently discovered a couple years ago, and it contains 45 pages of new story. The book also features a preview of a sequel called The Things from Another World, which is being written by John Gregory Betancourt. However, there have been no updates since 2019. There is a book on Amazon called The Thing from Another World, or The Things from Another World. It was released in 2010. Not this project, but the titles are so closely wrapped together. Who is going to know? Unfortunately, that's what it is. However, we are going to be getting a Frozen Hell movie. Blumhouse Productions announced in early 2020 that they are teaming up with Universal Pictures to turn the expanded book into a whole new film. No word on if John Carpenter is going to be producing that. He is currently doing the Halloween trilogy with Blumhouse, so it just makes all the sense in the world that he would still find a way to work on this, or at least, if anything, compose the score, which I would hope. But, at the end of the day, I love The Thing. It's hold up over time. It is such a fun movie to watch. Yes, it's gory, it's disgusting, it's violent, but it is so Carpenter and Kurt Russell, and it's just amazing that these guys have worked together as well as they have over the years. And it has a movie that was completely trashed when it came out and found a new audience over time, and that's awesome, and I love it. And I want the 4K. I'm probably going to buy that Scream Factory, just to be honest with you. But as always, I want to hear your thoughts. If you are listening to this in podcast form on iTunes or Spotify or Anchor, please leave a review, leave a like where you can. If you're listening to this on YouTube and you made it this far, I greatly appreciate it. Please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. I'll talk to you guys next week when I'm going to be covering Jaws, and then the following week will be Mortal Kombat, because they moved to Mortal Kombat, so I gotta, go with the flow on that one. And I'll talk to you guys then. Have yourself a great week. Thank you for listening to Podio Commentary. My name is Matt Jarbo. Peace out.